again, these key things that make medicines work. And they describe, and see the title there, a 25-year landslide in the manufacture and business of active ingredients in Europe. It really was a landslide. And here's the landslide when it comes to penicillin. Again, a medicine that I'm sure we all know people in our families or ourselves who've taken it. This is a busy graph, but you see the red or maroon color bars there. That is global penicillin production, and you see it going up from 1990s up to 2007. And then you see the other part of the bar graph in the light blue. And look what was happening. Chinese penicillin production went up dramatically, especially around 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And what this small number of companies did is they dumped it on the global market at really cheap price. This is what happens with steel right now. It's dumped on before tariffs. It's dumped on the U.S. market at really cheap prices. And other businesses can't compete. They can't sell it for that cheap price. And the Chinese companies can do it because they're subsidized by their government. So they drove out U.S. and European producers. And look what happens. Look at the yellow line. See how price went down from 1996 and all the way down to 2006, and then it went back up again. So they gained control of the market, and then they started a huge price increase after they attained global dominant market share. This is what we're seeing happen. So how could this happen? How did the U.S. allow drugs to be sold with ingredients made in China for nearly 20 years and to allow all these market games to be played without FDA oversight and inspection of the places where they were made? How did this happen? There's a great quote from a gentleman in the U.S. industry in the New York Times about a decade ago. He said, "We can blame the Chinese for this stuff as much as we want, but the truth of the matter is we're the people who are buying. And we all want cheap drugs, and companies want cheaper places to make them so they can earn a higher profit on the margin." So we do have to look in the mirror. And if we have pension funds in the stock market with drug stocks, we all want to see our stock portfolios go up if we have them. I don't, but a lot of people do. And so we want to keep seeing more and more profit because we benefit from that as shareholders. So we all have to look in the mirror. But what happened to regulatory oversight? See, the United States really did develop this gold standard. And here we moved production over to China. And look what was happening in 2007. The first leader of China's equivalent, FDA, was found guilty of taking bribes to approve untested and fake drugs. And he was executed by the Chinese government. Again, this is all the same thing that was happening around the time of the heparin incident. And here's what a spokesperson for the China FDA said with great candor. As a developing country, China's current food and drug safety situation is not very satisfactory because supervision started late. Its foundation is weak, so the supervision of food and drug safety isn't easy. This is where we were outsourcing production of so many important medicines found in our medicine cabinets, used in hospitals, operating rooms, emergency rooms. Really, really remarkable. And it happened all under the radar. And the then FDA Commissioner Margaret Hamburg said, "I think people have no idea in this country about the vulnerability of things that we count on every day, food, drugs, medical devices. We have a system that has big gaps in our protective mechanisms, and it's a growing problem." Just as a side point, one of the discoveries in writing this book was how we're doing the same thing with medical devices. American and European and other companies are moving production over to China. And pretty soon we'll be seeing, if we're not already, hip and knee implants coming from there, CT scanners, and so much more. And how well equipped is the FDA to really check to ensure that the products are safe? On a positive front, Congress enacted reforms in 2012, and it required all foreign generic drug makers and those who make active ingredients to register annually with the FDA and pay a fee. And FDA inspections of those facilities will be on par with those of the U.S., although everybody tells me in the industry that To go into a plant in China and do an inspection is nowhere near what it's like to do it in the U.S. Here it's the same language, similar culture, familiar culture, and inspectors are in there for a lot longer, typically. It's much more challenging to do these kinds of inspections in other countries, including China. And the reality is inspections don't guarantee quality and safety. And here's a great case in point. Bloomberg published an article in 2015 after these reforms. And at least the FDA was getting in these plants, but a Pfizer plant hid failures and used old ingredients, according to the FDA inspection report. Here's what the FDA found. Employees at the Pfizer plant concealed quality failures, used expired materials, and retested failing products until they passed. And this was particularly stunning. The FDA reported that a manufacturing unit had only one standalone toilet in disrepair 50 yards from the aseptic manufacturing unit. Inside the facility, inspectors saw no hand washing station, and an open pit appeared to be used as a urinal. This is 21st century medicine making. It's really remarkable. Safety continues to remain a challenge. The FDA does its best. I think many are committed to doing well by American consumers. They continue to find fake factories that say they're making drug products for the U.S. when in fact they're actually a front for another company. That said, China has many state-of-the-art factories, but quality is uneven. How dependent are we? Now we're coming to the point where veterans, the Veterans Health Administration, under pressure from the industry, now is permitted to buy drugs made in China. That was precluded a couple of years ago, unless they could get it nowhere else. But now, with pressure from industry, because so much is coming from there, the VA can buy drugs made in China. And the same is for the military. The Department of Defense uses drug products made in China when no other source is available. So what happens when young men and women are in the South China Sea on those vessels? Are they dependent on the adversary for their medicines? That's certainly not a situation that anyone wants to see. You know, when people ask me, give me an example of how dependent we really are, what really shocked you, what really woke you up? And as I did this research on this book over the past 3 years, every month there was a page-turner, a jaw-dropper, that was surprising because none of this is reported to the public. It's all hidden, and China RX exposes it. So how dependent are we? We're so dependent on China that when the FDA banned drug products from a Chinese company, the agency exempted 14 products, including key ingredients for chemotherapies used in cancer treatment, because of concerns about drug shortages. The FDA had banned 29 products, and they exempted 14, again, because of concerns that here in the U.S., we would have drug shortages. And the dependency is growing. It's not getting any easier. One of the real discoveries of China RX is naming, for the first time, generic drugs that are being made in China by Chinese companies and sold in the U.S. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of what we found. We have antibiotics, antidepressants, birth control pills, high blood pressure medicine, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and epilepsy medicines, chemotherapies, and HIV/AIDS medicine. As mentioned earlier, China is really ramping up production of generic drugs for sale in the United States. And I said to an executive of a U.S.-based generic drug company that China is an existential threat to your business. I think it's important for a country like the United States, an advanced developed country, to have manufacturing capability. We still manufacture a lot of medicines in this country, but we're losing it, and we're losing it quickly. Americans are losing jobs. Western drug companies have invested billions of dollars in research and development facilities in China. And here was a quote from a trade industry newsletter. It was fashionable for U.S.-based firms to announce job cuts at home and expansions in China in almost the same breath. So we're moving from one country to the other, and tens of thousands of jobs have been lost. This is a quote from a recruiter. The top companies have laid off many top-tier scientists and clinicians. They're outsourcing research to contract research organizations where salaries are much lower than in the U.S., meaning trouble for many talented, skilled people who have found it difficult to find work. These chemists are being tossed aside, often at the peak of their careers, top chemists from prestigious universities with experience at the top pharmaceutical companies. There's just no place to absorb all these scientists. And while there's a call for young people to get into STEM jobs, we're seeing an industry where there's been, during a time period in the early 2000s, 86,000 chemists who were laid off. Absolutely stunning. And here's what an industry observer said, and I think this is where we're headed. Unless very radical changes are made in how the U.S. funds, trains, and builds for pharma development and manufacturing, I can't see very much left here in 20 years. Perhaps each U.S.-based multinational will consist of a government affairs and marketing headquarters only, with everything else dispersed overseas. And as one industry insider said, I think it is a security concern, this dependence. He and I talked about the antidote for anthrax. I'm sure all of you remember when we had the anthrax attacks in Washington, D.C. and New York. And it turns out the U.S. had to get Cipro from a European manufacturer. I spoke to the CEO of that company, and he in turn said we had to get the starting material from China. And as this industry observer said, well, what if China is the anthrax attacker? It's not a good position to be in. We present a lot of recommendations in China RX about thinking of our medicines as a strategic asset, about having a forecasting and tracking system like we do for food and energy to make sure we don't run into shortages, which are pervasive now in healthcare for lots of reasons, including dependence on China. And also we need to bring some manufacturing back home. But for consumers and the public, we have an appendix in China RX on how to find out where your medicines are made. I'm going to show you this label for an Alzheimer's drug. And this is what we usually don't see when we pick up a prescription from the drugstore. You can see this is a generic for Alzheimer's, 5 milligram tablet. And you can see manufactured by a company in China and distributed by Salco Healthcare in the U.S. in Cranberry, New Jersey. Salco is the U.S. distribution arm of the Chinese company. So here's an Alzheimer's medicine made in China by a Chinese company and sold by their distributor here. And I found this from, you see in the bottom left-hand corner, the NIH, National Institute of Health, National Library of Medicine. That's one of the sources where you can find information on drug labels. The labels are on the box of your medicine, and you can see the website DailyMed at National Library of Medicine at nih.gov. Then there's another one called druginserts.com, and you have to scroll down to see the label, and you may or may not be able to find out where it was made. The other thing you can do is ask your pharmacist to show you the box if you happen to pick up your prescription in person, and take a photo of the box with your phone. And the other thing you can do is call the company and ask. And some companies were very forthcoming, and others were not. So I will stop there. I know a number of you are familiar with these other books. I'm grateful for you for joining tonight, and I hope we can have lots of great questions and some conversation.